guys, look what I just made. I've wanted to try rolling round doors on a cabinet for a while, and when I decided to build some bathroom storage, I knew this was the perfect project. There are a lot of different ways that you could use to tackle this challenge. Keep watching to see how I did it. I wanted to be able to control the dimensions and materials of my cabinet, so I decided to build the frames of my mirrors. You can skip this part if you'd like and just buy store-bought mirrors to keep it simple. To make the round mirror frame, I started by cutting 10.5-inch long pieces that I would glue up to make one larger hexagon. This part was really simple. I just glued up 6 pieces cut at 30 degrees off square and used wood glue to hold the joints tight. I forgot to video, but you can see in the photo here that I included a scrap block glued between 2 of the parallel pieces. This gave me a center point that I could attach a circle jig to later. I made sure that all my clamps had even pressure to try to hold the shape into a perfect hexagon while the glue dried. With both mirror frames and clamps, I turned my attention to the cabinet box. I bought an 8-foot long 1x12 poplar board from my local Home Depot. At home, I used my Kreg AccuCut and a piece of foam insulation to cut the larger board into smaller pieces for the cabinet components. For the main joinery of the cabinet box, I decided to use pocket holes. I recently received a Kreg Foreman and it made quick work of drilling all of those holes. One tip when building furniture: if you have multiple pieces that are going to be the same length, cut one board that length and then use that as a reference to cut the exact length of all the other pieces. It will be way more accurate than measuring multiple times with a tape measure. So at this point I made a huge mistake. Don't do what I just did. I thought I could get a nicer result if I attached the face frames to the top and bottom of the cabinet before I started putting the pieces together. I actually created a huge problem and ended up causing myself a lot more work in the long run. So once your cabinet components are cut, go ahead and start assembling and don't attach the face frames yet. Another tip that helps me build higher quality furniture is to sand all my components before I put them together. Within the cabinet, there's a 1/4-inch MDF panel. To accommodate the panel, I measured from the front edge of the top, bottom, and sides of the cabinet box pieces. I then used a router with a 1/4-inch upward spiral bit to cut a 1/4-inch deep groove. I then used my circular saw and AccuCut to cut the MDF panel down to size. Next, I turned my attention back to the mirror frames. I used a router and a DIY circle jig to cut 2 17-inch circles, 3/4 inches wide, from the hexagons I had glued up before. I took multiple passes, only cutting about 1/4 inch deep at a time to try to reduce tear out. This step was much easier with an extra set of hands. With the circle frames cut, I sanded them smoothly before I moved to the next step. To turn the rings into frames that would hold a mirror, I needed to cut a small rabbet or notched section on the back of the frames. I used a router, a rabbeting bit, and a small block of wood to cut a 3/8 inch wide by 1/4 inch deep rabbet on the inside back edge. This part sounds a little scary, but the ball bearing on the router bit actually makes it really easy. Once again, I sanded the mirror frames, this time by hand and working my way all the way up through the grits, up to a 220. I dry fit the cabinet box pieces together and used clamps to hold them in place. I placed the mirror frames inside the opening where they would be, once the whole box was assembled. I used a pencil and a compass to trace the inside lines of the mirror rings, about 1.5 inches smaller than the inner diameter of the rings. You'll see why in just a little bit. I used a cordless drill to drill a pilot hole and then cut the center figure 8 shape out of the MDF panel using a jigsaw. Next, I began to assemble the cabinet box pieces. I use a little trick when I'm building with pocket holes to prevent movement. First, I apply wood glue to the joint of the connecting pieces. Then I temporarily secure them in place with a 23 gauge pin nailer. Then I used a drill to drive 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws through the pocket holes on the inside of the cabinet. The pins help hold the pieces together and prevent slippage when I drive the screws. Next, I added the 1x5 shelf in the middle of the cabinet box. I secured it in place using glue and more 1 1/4 inch screws through pocket holes on the underside of the shelf. I gave the cabinet box a good sanding and moved on to finishing. I applied 3 coats of water-based wipe-on polyurethane. I used a water-based finish because the wood I was using was poplar and I wanted to try to keep it as light and blonde as possible. The downside of water-based finish is you have to sand after the first coat because the water raises the grain of the wood and makes it rough. When the finish was fully dried, I added my round mirrors to the frames. I set the mirrors in the rabbet on the back side of the frames, then used hot glue to secure them in place. The 1/4 inch MDF panel I used had a melamine coating on one side, so it didn't need to be finished at all. This is the part where you see the big mistake I made with the face frames. Had I left the face frames off, I could have assembled the entire cabinet including the bottom before finishing. However, with the face frames attached to the top and bottom, there was no way to insert the mirrors once the cabinet was put together. My only option was to slide the MDF panel in, then attach the bottom of the cabinet box. This process worked, but it's not as ideal as assembling the box pieces together prior to applying finish. Make sure to remember to finish the face frame pieces and the center rails as well, separately. I really can't thank you guys enough for watching. When you give this video a like and hit the subscribe button, it helps my channel grow and I can offer new ideas. I used scrap 3/4 inch wide boards to use as spacers between both mirrors and the center rail. This ensured a nice consistent 3/4 inch wide gap for the mirrors to roll in. I secured the center rails to the bottom and top of the cabinet using glue and more 23 gauge pins. At this point, the entire cabinet was assembled. I just needed a way to mount it on the wall. I drilled pilot holes, then used a router with a keyhole bit to cut a keyhole on each side piece on the back of the cabinet. All that was left was to add screws to the wall and hang the cabinet in place. I'm really happy this experiment worked out. The doors actually roll perfectly. I was a little worried they wouldn't, but they do. They work great. You can see if the MDF backer panel wasn't cut slightly smaller than the mirrors, then you would have been able to look past the mirrors straight into the cabinet. I also discovered mirrors are really hard to photograph. If you like kind of weird and quirky ideas like this, make sure to check out my OSB and epoxy dresser, or maybe my rock and resin end table. Make sure to tag that like button and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys!